Hello everyone, I'm Heather, and today's video is partly a follow-up from my previous video. I talked about what happens when you apply for an initial passport or you send in your passport for renewal and it doesn't come back in time for your trip. And I used my oldest son as an example because we have not received his passport back in time for our upcoming cruise on Royal Caribbean's Utopia of the Seas. So I have some bad news. We're leaving in just a matter of days. He is not going to have his passport back in time for the cruise, and this is why. Andrew had mailed in his old passport, which was expired. It expired in February of 2024, in the latter half of June, along with his application, his passport photo, a check for the passport fee, and including an extra $60 for expedited processing. At the time he checked the status in mid-July, it said they had only started processing it on July 1st. So first of all, the mail travel time until they receive it and start processing it was pretty slow. And then on July 31st, so more than a month after he had mailed it in, he got an email which will be followed up with a letter stating that they cannot process his passport application because he forgot to sign his check. They say in the letter, which is just an attachment to the email, and they're going to be following it up with the actual letter, that included with the letter is his voided check that he sent in. This is probably going to be an increasingly common problem for people, and is just a reminder of why it's so important when you're doing something as important as trying to get a passport that you have to be very careful when you do all the things, and I'll come back to that. But what happened in Andrew's case is people just don't write checks anymore. And we were actually surprised. My dad and I were just discussing, we don't know why the State Department can't just use the routing number and the account number off the bottom of the check to process the payment. But like, most other places do, almost nobody writes checks anymore. I read an article recently that said that the average American today only writes one check a year. Now, I looked back, and so far in 2024, I had written like 7-8 checks, and most of them, honestly, were to dentists. They were for dental bills, but even if I think about that, I probably even could have paid those bills another way, like with a card or something, and not had to have written a check. So honestly, in this day and age, it's very unlikely that you really need checks for anything. If you're going to be paying bills, there should always actually be a way to pay it electronically, either directly out of your bank account or with a debit or credit card. And if you're paying someone, in your personal life, there's lots of cash apps for that. You can use Zelle right through your bank, the Cash App or Venmo, which we use all the time. I use it to pay my lawn mowing guy. And my kids and I send each other money on Venmo. I mean, there's lots of ways to pay people that don't involve having to write anyone a check. Megan checked and she wrote 2 checks in the last year. One to my father, who does still write a lot of checks, and one to an office that she had to write at school for some tickets for a show she was going to. In that case, when she wrote that check, she actually had to ask the lady in the office to help her because she couldn't remember exactly how to write the check out. And Andrew admitted to me, I haven't written a check in so long, Mom. I guess I just forgot. He did say that he thought he had signed it. And I'm curious when he gets the actual check back in the mail so he can look at it. We think what he might have done is endorsed it, which is where you flip the check over and sign your name on the top edge on the back. That's if the check is written out to you and you're cashing the check. It's very possible that that's the only thing Andrew's ever done with a check before. He may never have had any reason to write a check out to anyone. So he just didn't know how to write it out. I'm actually going to link the same WikiHow article. It's really nice and simple with some good pictures that I sent to all 3 of my kids now to show them exactly how to write out a check. I actually taught this in a personal finance class that I taught high schoolers when I was a high school teacher. It was a required class. All high school students in the district I was teaching in had to take, and I taught a class on personal finance. And in that class, one of the many things I taught the kids how to do was to write out a check and to balance their checkbook and things like that. But this is a dying art, if you will. I taught that class over 30 years ago. So it's not surprising with the way technology and banking and everything has advanced that this is not a skill that people still have. And I really don't understand why the State Department or the federal government hasn't realized this, and it has not made it easier for people to use a different form of payment to get their passports done. Now, you do have an alternative. You can use a money order, but again, most young people these days aren't going to even know what a money order is. I mean, unless they don't have a checking account and they need a money order to pay bills. And there are some people like that they just don't have a bank account. And I explained to Andrew, I said, you have to take the cash, the exact amount of cash, to the post office, and then they will give you the money order that you can include and send back to the State Department. The letter told him that he has 90 days to send in a new check or a new money order. And if he doesn't send it in that time, then his application will be canceled or voided, and he'll have to start all over again and send in a new form and a new picture. And they would send him his expired passport back at that point because he's going to have to send it back in. So obviously, ideally, he wants to send in the money within the 90 days so that they can finish processing his passport. But obviously, we are not going to get his passport back in time. As soon as he got that and told me that, I went that minute and found his birth certificate. And I did have it in my personal fire safe here at home. I'm sure I have another copy in my safe deposit box at the bank, but referring back to my last video, if you don't know where your birth certificate is, that could be a very difficult task to locate your birth certificate. I just want to give you a couple of reminders or tips in this video so that the same kind of thing doesn't happen to you. I want to point out to you that it was more than a month between the time Andrew mailed in his old passport for renewal and the time that he got the email from the State Department saying that they couldn't process it because he had not signed his check. That gives you an idea of how slow and long this process of getting a passport renewed can be. And so especially if you're applying for a passport for the very first time and you've never had one before, because when you've had one before, they have the old passport to work off of, and they have all those records and everything that you supplied the documentation proving your identity and your citizenship previously in the past. But if you've never done that before, that's an even longer process. So it's very, very important. I cannot stress this enough. I've said this in several videos now, that it's very important that you apply for your passport or apply for your passport renewal way in advance of when you're going to need that passport. Think months, not weeks. What we tend to do, because like I've said before, most countries will require you to have 3 to 6 or more months of validity left on your passport before you return back to your home country. So, for example, if you are traveling somewhere, I'll give you Megan as an example. She's going to Germany in January. So her passport needs to not expire. It doesn't. She has lots left on it, but this is just an example. Her passport needs to be good and not expire through at least June. There needs to be at least 6 months past the time that she's going to be visiting Germany. When we get to that point on our passport validity, and again, you have to time it out with when you're going to be traveling and things like that, you need to make sure that your passport is valid for at least 6 months past the time that you're taking the trip. For example, my next passport, I think, expires in October of whatever year it is. So 6 months before that, April is when I'm going to send it in for renewal. Anything after April, I can't take a trip on that passport anymore. So you really need to think of your passport as expiring 6 months before it actually does. So if my passport expires in October, it really expires in April. So April is when I want to be sending it in for renewal, or earlier. Or, you could send it in between if you don't have a trip coming up. If you're not going to be traveling for a couple of years internationally, then and you know you're not going to need it. But I just feel really strongly that it's really important to have your passport valid all the time. You don't want to just be sitting around with an expired passport. That's kind of a waste. There are times when you might need or want to take an international trip kind of at the last minute. And if you don't have a valid passport, you can't do that. Here's another example. While we were on that same phone conversation yesterday, Andrew said he's been really into watching the Olympics in Paris that are happening right now. And he said to me, he loves Paris. You know how I feel about Paris if you've watched my previous videos, but he loves Paris. He spent a lot of time in Paris. He's been there several times. He spent an extended stay, like kind of living there for a while. He likes the Olympics a lot, and he would really like to be in Paris. He's very jealous. A friend of mine from high school and his wife are actually in Paris for the Paris Olympics right now, and he's been posting stories every day. And so I've been kind of following along with that. But he said to his friend, oh gosh, I really wish we hadn't had the bar exam because Andrew took the bar exam last week so that we could have been in Paris right now for the Olympics. And I kind of meanly but also jokingly said, you know why else you couldn't be in Paris for the Olympics? Because you don't have a passport. So I was kind of joshing him that he made this mistake, that he didn't sign his check. So the real lesson from this, in addition to how important it is to apply for first passport or send in your soon to expire or expired passport for renewal very, very early, long before your trip. The other thing that you really have to make sure you do, which is the big takeaway from this, is you have to be very careful with, government type documents like this. There's basically 4 things I would say that you could mess up on when you're sending in a passport application or a passport renewal. Number 1 is filling out the form. So when you fill out that form, and there's different forms depending on who you are in your situation, and the State Department's travel website with the passport section, which I will link down below too, does help you determine which form you need. And then when you fill out that form, you got to make sure you do it very carefully, fill it out completely, and sign it. This is another thing that people often forget to sign is the actual application form. You must sign the form or it's invalid and they can't process it. The second thing that I think that people mess up on is the photo. You have to submit a photo. It used to be 2 photos, but now they only need 1. And it has to meet certain requirements. It has to be like against a blank wall. It has to be a certain size. I think it's 2 by 2 square. It has to be just your head. You cannot have glasses on. So when we get our passport photo, even though 3 of the 4 of us almost always are wearing glasses, you have to take your glasses off, and you really should not be smiling. What they actually say is that you're supposed to have a neutral expression. So, but what it really is that they're thinking of how you're going to look when you're traveling through the airport. Nobody's traveling through the airport going, I mean, maybe you are, but not at the end of your trip. Not at the end of a long overnight international flight where you've had trouble sleeping on the plane and you're jet lagged and everything. You're going to look more like this. Okay, so we joke actually that we all look like some kind of criminal in our passport photo, and it's true. But that's pretty much close to how you're going to look when you go through immigration on the other end when you arrive in another country. So you're not supposed to smile in your passport photo. So if you get any of those things wrong, they're not going to process it because your photo doesn't meet the requirements. Like if you send in a picture and you have glasses on, they're going to send it back to you and make you redo it, which is causing further delays. If you want to make sure you get your passport photo done right, just go to some place that takes passport photos. Don't try to do it yourself. Walmart takes them, Walgreens, CVS, Staples. There's lots of places you can get a passport photo taken, and it's not very expensive. It's like $5, $10 or something. It's not very much. And they do a good job. I mean, at our Walmart here where we usually go, they take out a white screen and they set it up, and then they have you stand there and they take it for you. And then They print it actually the correct size so it meets the specifications. So that's the best way to do that. Okay, the third way that people will mess up on their passport application or renewal is what Andrew did, something to do with the payment. So either they don't have the correct amount, they don't include the right fees for what they want done, or they don't send the right thing or mess it up somehow. So like in Andrew's case, he didn't sign the check. It's also possible you could have forgotten something else on the check, or you have the money order the wrong amount or something like that. So something with the payment is wrong, and then this example shows that they can't process that then either. And then the fourth mistake that you might make on your passport application or renewal is not including the things in the envelope that need to be in there. And basically on an initial application, you need to have the form, a passport photo, payment, and then your documents, which you can find a list of what are acceptable documents to prove your identity and your citizenship on the State Department's travel website. If you're renewing your passport, the 4 things that need to go into the envelope are the form, the payment, the passport photo, and your old passport if you have it. If you had a passport before but you don't have it anymore, or it was like damaged beyond repair or something, you lost it, it was stolen, something like that, you dropped it in a river, whatever, there is a way to check on the form what happened, what the status of the passport is. So they will be able to tell if you had a passport issued to you before and you need to specify, well, here it is, here's the one you issued to me before, the last one if you've had more than one, or it's damaged or it's lost or whatever, so that they know why you're not sending it in with the rest of the stuff. So those are the 4 things that you really need to watch out for when you apply for a passport or apply for a passport renewal. Making sure you're filling out that form very carefully and accurately and completely. Making sure your photo that you send in meets the photo requirements. Making sure your payment method is exactly what they need and done correctly, and making sure that everything is in the envelope that you need to be in there. Be very careful and take your time when you're sending in your passport application or your passport renewal. One last reminder I want to say to people who've never done this before, the first time you send in a passport, you are still including all those things, but you have to apply in person. So the very first time you apply, or if you are a child under the age of 16, you must apply for your initial passport in person. If you're a child under the age of 16, it's all the times you apply for a passport until you apply for the first one when you're over 16. For example, my kids got one when they were, Ben's had about, a bunch of them now. He got one when he was a baby. He had to be in person. His parents had to be with him. He got one when he was 5. He got one when he was 10. He got one when he was 15. Now the next one, he will be over 16, but by then he'll be 20. Once you're 20, you're over 18. That's going to be his initial time applying as an adult. Still have to appear in person, even though he's had a passport before. Anytime the person is under 16, they have to appear in person with both parents, but there is a way around that. There is a form that you can fill out if the second parent cannot appear in person. And I've talked about that in videos before. Once you're over 16, like if you're between 16 and 18, 16, 17, 18, they only have to appear with one parent in person. And then once you're over 18, if it's your first time getting a passport when you're over 18, you have to appear in person, just the first time. And then every subsequent time that you renew your passport after that, which is every 10 years for an adult, it's 5 years for kids because their faces change so much. Once you're an adult, it's every 10 years that your passport is good for in the United States. Then you can renew it through the mail. And they are working on being able to renew them online, which will be great. And interestingly, I've already looked at it. And when you are able to renew it online, you can use a credit card. Let this be a warning to you that it's really important that you know how to write a check and know how to do it correctly. and all the other things I talked about in this video, so that your passport is renewed or processed in a timely manner. Because like I said, Andrew is not going to have his passport for this cruise that we're going on. Now, because he's not, I want to add one little thing. If you're going on a cruise and you don't have a passport, this is out of the United States, you might want to consider not getting off in ports. And the reason I say that is because if anything happens to you when you're in port and you can't get back on the ship, you get injured, have to go to the hospital, you get lost and miss the ship, anything like that, when you're in a foreign port, you're stuck there until you can get a passport issued to you in that place. You cannot fly back to your home country of the United States without a passport, which I talked about in the last video. So it can be risky to take a cruise without a passport, which is why all the cruise lines very strongly urge everyone to have a passport. I will tell you in the upcoming vlogs if and how Andrew not having a passport when the rest of us do affects our check-in process and our disembarkation process, because I think it will. Royal Caribbean has an extremely smooth and easy embarkation and disembarkation process if you have a passport. I don't actually know how it works if you don't have one, because I've never cruised without a passport before. So if anybody has any insight to that, let me know, because we still got a couple days and it would be nice for me to know what to expect. But otherwise, I'll let you guys know what it's like if you try to cruise without one and how the process is different. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I hope that this was helpful to you. Please keep these things in mind, because it's very important if you ever want to travel outside of the United States or your home country. Obviously, this whole thing's going to be slightly different if you're from another country, but the basic stuff is the same. Have a great day, everyone, and safe travels. Thank you.